So we're talking about evidence generation, and I was suggesting that we could do a much better job of generating evidence within the hemophilia community, despite the fact that in the entire bleeding disorders community we have a lot of ultra-orphan and orphan diseases. We've got some very large data gaps, and as I go through the rationale for evidence generation, I will point out some of those. So why do we need to generate evidence? Well, it's really fundamental to developing treatment regimens that are going to be optimal for different patient populations. And in the absence of generating that evidence, we really don't know if one regimen works better than another or less well than another. I've put a few examples up here. We could easily, in the course of a few minutes, generate a list of 50 examples in this community where we could generate more evidence. So what about the role of low trough levels in hemophilic arthropathy? Are microbleeds contributing to further progression of joint damage in hemophilia? What about prophylaxis for adults? It's not well established how beneficial that is. It makes sense that prophylaxis ought to be a good thing. If it's good for children, it ought to be good for adults. It ought to prevent morbidity and even mortality. But we don't have strong evidence to support that. And in the absence of that evidence, then we don't have good rationale for payers to pay for it. Previously untransfused patients, we had a little discussion about the risk of inhibitors, and I would submit that this goes beyond the risk of inhibitors. We ought to be looking at how we can prevent them from occurring, not just identifying what the risks are. The role of other genes in bleeding disorders, complications, and their sequelae. We've done very, very little. There's been some excellent work out of Europe, European labs, but almost nothing anywhere else. And there are opportunities now with the development of the human genome sequencing to be able to identify other contributors toward the pathogenesis of bleeding disorders. And then the need for collecting standardized outcome data. Much of our data is not standardized across the world, and how can we go about implementing a little bit more standardization there. So there is an efficacy effectiveness gap when clinical trials are run to look at new products and evaluate their efficacy in preventing bleeding episodes or in treating bleeding episodes. The patient populations tend to be more homogeneous, similar to one another. Whereas the patient populations around the world are really quite heterogeneous, and yet those are not the patients that are tested. So real-world evidence is really important to begin to gather to determine if the efficacy from the clinical trial really reflects what's happening in the real world. It's not only important for individuals with bleeding disorders to have good evidence-based medical treatment, but it's important for payers too to provide those kinds of data that would allow for easier development of reimbursement and payment for those products. So this is of critical importance as well. If we look at this small survey that was done, I have pointed it out to simply allow us to look at what payers think is important. And payers look at items like head-to-head comparisons for what they feel are very important. And as we go into all of the disease indications throughout medicine, where we've sometimes got thousands and thousands of patients that may even be in a clinical trial, head-to-head comparisons are of critical importance. But in the bleeding disorders community, we tend to look more on patient-reported outcomes and even quality of life indicators. So we need to determine how to raise their importance with payers by doing more standardized work in order to develop the rigor that is required when one looks at patient-reported outcomes. So let's turn to a few examples. I introduced the concept of previously untransfused patients and the risk of inhibitor development. We know from some excellent work that has occurred over the past 10 or 15 years what many of the risks are for inhibitor development on a population basis. We don't, unfortunately, know what it is on an individual patient basis. the gene defect itself. A variety of environmental impacts have been evaluated and increased the odds ratio or the relative risk depending on the study that was done. And then manufacturers run their products through PUPS studies. But they look at very small numbers of PUPs, and those PUPs are extremely heterogeneous from one study to another. And so an inhibitor rate of 15% or 30% may not be different because the studies are so small. And yet that consumes a tremendous number of PUPs. We might have 300 pups a year born in the United States with factor VIII deficiency, maybe 450 a year in Europe. And so these pups are a precious commodity. Half of the pups are spontaneous mutations. And so chances are they're going to be identified somewhere outside of a hemophilia treatment center and aren't going to be able to enter a trial because they will have already been identified because of a bleed and then infused with the product. So we're dealing with a small, precious commodity. And what I would submit is that the reason for doing those is to look for immunogenicity. But the sensitive indicator for immunogenicity really is the previously transfused patients. In previously transfused patients, which is where all these clinical trials start that evaluate new potential products, those patients have seen everything, and if they were going to develop an inhibitor because of genetic or environmental reasons, it would have happened. So that's a population that can specifically look at a new product, and if that new product is problematic, they'll develop an inhibitor. And as we know from all of the studies that have occurred over many years, that has not occurred in any of the clinical trials for new products and really only occurred back in the early 1990s with a new viral inactivation process. So that sentinel system is a really important one that I think has established validity. So the question would be, should we continue to generate product-specific evidence on inhibitor rates, or should we start looking at these PUPs as a resource to determine how to prevent these inhibitors from forming? You know, whether an inhibitor rate is 30% or 40% or 20%, that is too high. And so what can we be doing to intervene as new patients begin to receive factor replacement therapy to prevent them from making an inhibitor? That's something that I think we as a community have paid very little attention to, and pharma really has no incentive to pursue some questions like that. They're primarily interested in looking at their particular product. I'd like to now give an example of genes in looking at the risk of sequelae to bleeding disorders and describe a program that is a collaboration between the U.S. National Hemophilia Foundation, the American Thrombosis Hemostasis Network, which is the database organization in the United States, Northwest Blood Work, which does DNA work, and Biogen, to collect blood samples from 5,000 individuals with hemophilia A or B in the United States. The first purpose of doing that is to genotype patients with hemophilia A or B. Unlike in many places in Europe, genotyping has not been done routinely in the United States. And so this would answer the question of what the mutation is, the causative mutation for hemophilia. But the real reason and the important reason for doing this is to create a research repository where DNA can be analyzed and looked for, and one can look for risk factors for the complications of hemophilia, whether it's inhibitors or joint damage or other risk factors. Initially, 2,000 samples have been sent to the NIH for full genome sequencing, and that's already ongoing. In the next 6 months or so, this repository will be open to research investigators who have scientific questions that they would like to answer using this repository. So this is big data. It's something that is being done in other diseases, and we are very fortunate now to be able to have this number of samples to be able to answer a number of significant research questions. All of that goes into evidence-based generation of data that will contribute down the road toward new treatment modalities. This is not a short-term project. We're looking 10 to 20 years out for the real benefits of this to occur, but unless something starts like this now, we won't have that advantage in 10 or 20 years. And then there's the question of standardizing outcome data. And some of you may have heard about the new WFH initiative to generate a worldwide bleeding disorders registry. We've got good registries throughout Europe as well as in the United States, Canada, those have provided a lot of significant information. I can think of the U.S. registry that really got started through the Centers for Disease Control. And I see Mike Susi sitting here in the audience. They have probably published 25 articles that have been really important in looking at the natural history and outcomes of hemophilia. But that's relatively homogeneous. And what about the rest of the world? What about the entire world? How can we understand what the outcomes are in much more heterogeneous populations? So we've set about at the WFH to establish the World Bleeding Disorders Registry. It will be a global database of high-quality observational data, and it'll be collected on a large population of people coming from different countries, different types of treatment centers. The pilot phase of this is underway with 31 HTCs. We plan to complete that by the end of the year. We'll evaluate the feasibility then of initiating the full-blown trial. You could consider the pilot phase as a beta test to determine what the problems are in collecting the data and how we could correct that. So the real purposes of a registry like this aren't simply to collect the data. It's to be able to utilize the data to look at gaps in the evidence generation related to patient management. And while we may find gaps in homogeneous centers, we will find gaps that are much greater in a much more heterogeneous population of treatment centers. To support advocacy initiatives. And so it's difficult to go to the government and request additional support and advocacy for hemophilia and bleeding disorders if we don't have data to back that up. This registry can provide the data to further back that up. And then finally, that database of patients via the hemophilia treatment centers will allow the scientific community as well as the clinical research community to address many unsolved clinical questions on diagnosis, access to care, and over a period of time will elevate the level of care simply based upon the generation of evidence supporting a higher level of care and good patient outcomes. And so the last example I'll give is the concept of trough level of 1%. And you know, that's something that has been established in the community over a long period of time. Historically, as prophylaxis regimens came into existence, it was based upon two things. One was a relative shortage of products. There was never enough product to be able to think of anything other than a 1% trough. And the second was the burden of treatment, frequent intravenous injections. But the third, and perhaps the most important one, was price. It would cost considerably more to set a trough of 2% than it would a trough of 1%. Well, the problem with a 1% trough is that sometimes you go below it and are at risk of bleeding. Sometimes 1% isn't sufficient in order to prevent bleeding, especially in target joints, and a higher percentage is needed in order to prevent bleeds. And I think it's been well established that at these 1% troughs, microbleeds occur, subclinical bleeds that we're not even aware of, but over a period of years, if one looks at radiographic diagnosis, one can see joint damage still occurring even in prophylaxis. And so that's a problem. Mark, in his plenary address back in 2012, addressed the concept of 15% troughs. That's a difficult thing to achieve with factor replacement therapy, but it may not be a difficult thing to achieve with some newer products that are in the pipeline. So products such as the bispecific antibody imicizumab, as they begin to reveal their phase 3 data, we'll get a better understanding of their troughs. Their phase 1 data, rather than troughs that go like this, have troughs that go like this. That's a big difference. And the same thing would apply to gene therapy. By definition, there are no troughs in gene therapy. And so as we go forward, I think that it will be important to generate evidence-based data that higher trough levels are, in fact, much more important in fully preventing any bleeding episodes. So those should be changing treatment paradigms as we go forward. So to plan for more optimal treatment outcomes, we do need more data, which is also known as evidence generation. We'll have the World Bleeding Disorders Registry. I think the U.S. 5,000 patient repository will yield a variety of important and really unknown answers to questions that will be addressed. And then what are the consequences if we don't continue to move forward toward more evidence-based generation of data? I think we're going to miss more and more opportunities to elevate the standards of treatment and care for individuals with bleeding disorders around the world. So it's important that we do continue to move forward to develop these modalities.